Hey everybody, thanks for watching. I've entitled this video Uncrucifying the Messiah for a reason that I'm going to get to in just a minute. But before we do that, I want to show you a slide of an archaeological dig. So what you're looking at is a wall in what many people now believe to be the New Testament city of Emmaus. So in the mid-2nd century BC, there was a Seleucid general who built various fortifications in Judea. This was during the Maccabean revolt. So this was the time period when the Jews under the leadership of the Maccabean family had revolted against their Seleucid overlords for various reasons, most prominently because the Seleucid general had desecrated the temple with various kinds of pagan sacrifices, including a pig upon the altar there at the temple. So they revolted against him, and one of their early leaders, Judas Maccabeus, had been killed in battle by the Seleucid general. And during this time period, the Seleucid armies began to build various fortifications in this particular area of Judea. And we know that they built one of these at the city of Emmaus. Well, this particular wall that you're looking at here, which is about 3 meters thick and in some places still stands 2 meters tall. This is dated to that particular time period. So this was probably that city which in the New Testament is called Emmaus. Now in the Old Testament, you may know of a city named Kiriath Ye'arim. It's an extremely important city because of the Ark of the Covenant. And most archaeologists now identify Emmaus with Kiriath Ye'arim. So you're looking at here an aerial picture of this particular city. It's important for the story of the Ark of the Covenant because if you remember this sort of humorous story, the Philistines had captured the Ark of the Covenant from the Israelites during a battle. They had taken it, and a series of plagues began to fall upon the Philistines so that they realized, hey, we got to get rid of the Ark of the Covenant. So as quick as they could, they actually brought it back to the Israelites. And they brought it back to the city of Kiriath Ye'arim, and that's where it remained for about 20 years. And the map that you're looking at now shows where this particular city was located. It's about 7 miles northwest of Jerusalem, which is exactly where the New Testament city called Emmaus was located. So Emmaus, or Kiriath Ye'arim, is this particular city, and it figures prominently into the well-known story recorded in Luke chapter 24 of the two disciples who were from Emmaus and were journeying home from Jerusalem, talking back and forth to each other, when a stranger approached them. At least they thought it was a stranger. It was Jesus, and their eyes were prevented from recognizing him. So we're going to pick it up from here and talk about the title of this video, Uncrucifying the Messiah. So what you're looking at now is a picture of extremely rare find. In fact, to my knowledge, this is the only find like it, of the remains, skeletal remains of someone who endured one of the most horrendous kinds of executions ever devised by man, that of Roman crucifixion. So we actually know the name of the person that these bones belong to. There were skeletal remains that were found in basically a bone box, an ossuary, in a section of Jerusalem in 1968. And when they opened up this box, they found that through one of the heels of the man to whom these bones once belonged, inside through one of the heels was a spike, a nail that would have been used in crucifixion. It was so firmly embedded in his bone that it was not removed even when he was buried. And now on the outside of the box was his name. We know that he was called Yehohanan. So this is just one bit of evidence for what crucifixion would have done to a person at that time. Now, Roman crucifixion was carried out for a long time. We don't know exactly when it started, but we know that it happened, was the preferred method of execution for centuries. In fact, even post-dating the New Testament, around 200 AD, we have graffiti evidence that was found in Rome in which someone was mocking a Christian by the name of Alexamenos. So this particular graffiti says Alexamenos worships his God. And of course, the one on the cross has the head of a donkey. This was just a further way in which the Christian would have been mocked for not only worshiping a crucified man, but worshiping someone with a head of an ass. So this was one bit of evidence we found by way of graffiti of just the continuing inability of a typical Roman to believe that anyone would actually worship someone who had been crucified. We have evidence also, literary evidence, from various people from around the time of Christ as to exactly what was thought about crucifixion. So this slide is a quote from the Roman statesman Cicero, who lived in the century before Christ, and he says that the word cross, crux, should be far removed not only from the person of a Roman citizen, but from his thoughts, his eyes, and his ears. For it is not only the actual occurrence of these things or the endurance of them, but liability to them, the expectation, even the very mention of them, that is unworthy of a Roman citizen and a free man. In other words, when you're in polite company as a Roman citizen, you don't even talk about crucifixion. It's just one of those subjects that is so gross, so shameful, that is not even to be mentioned in polite company. We also have a quote here from moving farther ahead into the 1st century AD from Seneca, who talks a little bit about what crucifixion did to a person. He says the crucified victim would be wasting away in pain, dying limb by limb, letting out his life drop by drop, fastened to the accursed tree, long sickly, already deformed, swelling with ugly tumors on chest and shoulders, and drawing the breath of life amid long drawn out agony. So I put these quotes out there not simply to kind of be macabre and focus upon the ghastly nature of this, but to drive a point home, because we become so accustomed to the cross or to talk about crucifixion in modern society that it's really difficult for us to wrap our minds around just how reprehensible this particular practice was. So if anyone would have talked about the worship of a crucified Messiah who wasn't a Christian, or worshiping someone who had been crucified, then it just would have been almost beyond belief that someone would stoop to such a level as to worship a crucified man. And that's why I titled this video, Uncrucifying the Messiah. Because in the 1st century mindset, the Messiah was not someone who was to be crucified. So if they could have done anything, they would have uncrucified him so that he had not endured such a shameful and a horrific death. Because when the Romans crucified someone, they did not crucify them simply to put them to death. Sometimes the cross is compared to our electric chair, for instance. Well, I understand the analogy, but it's really an extremely poor analogy, because there is absolutely nothing in our society, even though we have the death penalty, there's nothing in our society that is in any way comparable to the purpose of crucifixion. Because the purpose of crucifixion, again, was not simply to execute someone, but it was for various kinds of reasons. First of all, it was meant to shame the victim, because they were stripped nude and they were exposed publicly, and they were, of course, attached to this tree or this crossbeam with nails. So it was a purpose of shaming this particular victim. It was also a process of dehumanization, to treat them as if they were not even human by the way in which they were put to death. It was also on a kind of a state level, a way in which perpetual oppression was achieved, because this was the way in which the state made sure that anyone who pushed against them, anyone who threatened them, anyone who started any kind of rebellion would be oppressed, would be put to death in as worse a way as possible. And at that same time, it served then as a public warning. These were not carried out in secret, not behind walls. This happened publicly, often at crossroads, so that probably just about anyone living the 1st century at some point or other would have seen a crucifixion take place, or the remains of a crucifixion, because in most cases, the one who was crucified was not taken down from the cross, but they were left up there in order to serve as basically carrion for the birds. Their corpses would usually rot on the cross for some time. So this was an extreme way in which Rome made sure you knew what would happen to them, if you knew what would happen to you if you rebelled against the state. And so that is kind of the final point of crucifixion, in that it was one way of maintaining what's usually called the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. Well, bear in mind that Roman peace was soaked in the blood of victims of crucifixion. This was the way in which the state made sure that they maintained complete control over the peoples who were subject to them. So with that all in mind, we can understand why in Luke chapter 24, when these two Emmaus disciples are journeying along the road, one of them, in talking with Jesus, says that they had hoped that this prophet, mighty in word and deed, who was arrested and tried and crucified, they had hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel. So in the minds of this Emmaus disciple, if there's any one thing that they could have done, it would be to uncrucify the Messiah, unarrest him, bring him back to where he was before all of the events of Holy Week transpired. Because in their minds, the very fact that the Messiah was crucified was proof positive that his messianic mission had indeed failed. Of course, the great irony here, as Jesus begins to point out to them, is it was in the very crucifixion that his mission was a success. So the disciple thought that because he was crucified, he was unable to redeem Israel, but in fact, by that very crucifixion is how he achieved redemption for Israel, and not just for Israel, but for the entire world. So Jesus, as he begins to talk with these particular disciples, and again, they don't realize who this is, he says to them, "O foolish ones, and slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have spoken. Was it not ede in the Greek, which we might translate as divinely necessary? Was it not divinely necessary that the Christ should suffer these things and enter into his glory?" So Jesus tells him the exact opposite. This crucifixion, these sufferings had to take place. They were divinely necessary in order that redemption might be accomplished. And then we get to what really is my favorite part of the story, where Jesus applied the hermeneutic. So the Greek word for explain or interpret is diermeneusen, from which we get our word hermeneutic. Now, hermeneutics is nothing more than the art or science of interpretation. So when you take a class on hermeneutics, you're learning how to interpret the scriptures. You're learning how to explain them. And that's exactly what Jesus did. He gave them a mini course in hermeneutics on their 7-mile walk from Jerusalem to the city of Emmaus. And what he did is he opened up their minds to understand the scriptures. He laid down the interpretive method by which they could, beginning with Moses, beginning with the Torah, and working their way through the prophets, they could understand all of these stories are right by interpreting them in light of himself, in light of the Messiah. So whereas before they didn't really get it, their eyes were closed, now their eyes were opened by this teaching of Jesus in order that they might have the proper hermeneutic, the proper way of approaching and interpreting these scriptures, beginning with Genesis and working their way all through the rest of the prophets. Luther has this great quote where he talks about the Christ-centered nature of the Old Testament. He says that the Gospels and the epistles want themselves to be our guides, to direct us to the writings of the prophets and of Moses in the Old Testament, so that we might there read and see for ourselves how Christ is wrapped in the swaddling cloths and laid in a manger. That is, how he is comprehended in the writings of the prophets. So it's this image of Christ being, as it were, wrapped in the scrolls of the Torah and wrapped in the scrolls of the prophets, just like as a baby he was wrapped in the swaddling cloths and laid in a manger. That's how the shepherds knew where to find him, and that's how we know where to find him. We go to the manger of the law and the prophets. We go to the manger of the Old Testament, and we see there Christ wrapped in these swaddling cloths of the scriptures themselves. So over every page of the Old Testament, we should write, this is about the Messiah. Because in one way or another, every story, every prophecy, every narrative is directed toward this one who is the fulfillment of all things. So rather than uncrucifying the Messiah, we worship and we praise and we preach the crucified Christ. We determine to know nothing except Jesus Christ and him crucified, because indeed this is scandalous, but this is God's way, a way which seems foolish in the eyes of the world, but God's way of providing redemption for Israel and redemption for all of humanity. So I hope that this has taught you a little bit about the archaeology of this city of Emmaus, or Kiryat Yearim in the Old Testament, located about 7 miles from Jerusalem. And I hope it's given you a little bit more graphic insight into just exactly why crucifixion was so difficult for people of that time to get past, and just why it was such a radical message to preach not just a Messiah, but a crucified Messiah. And then thirdly, I hope it's helped you to understand exactly what Jesus was doing with these two disciples. He was teaching them how to interpret the Old Testament so that we too might learn when we read Genesis or Exodus or Psalms or Isaiah or Malachi or anything within the Old Testament, that we're looking for one primary message, and that is Jesus Christ, the anointed of God, the one whom God sends into the world in order to be our Savior and to suffer crucifixion and resurrection in order that we might have the redemption that God desires us to have. So thanks for watching. If this has been helpful to you, then please pass it along to others. I hope that you're all safe and healthy, and may God watch over each of you and bless you and your families. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next week.